Yesterday at the Orange County Airport, I had an interesting experience. I was getting ready to check in, get on a plane for Chicago, and from Chicago here to Atlanta. A little old lady was in front of me in line. She comes up to the counter and really sweet. I felt really bad for her, but she said, "The number says on my ticket that I'm supposed to get on this plane, but I'm going to Hartford." So the agent looked at the ticket and said, "Yes, ma'am, you're going to Chicago and you're going to change planes and go to Hartford." And she said, "Well, I'm supposed to go to Hartford, not to Chicago." The agent said, "Yes, that's right. You're going to go first to Chicago, then you're going to change planes, and then you're going to go to Hartford." And she thought for a minute, and you can almost see it kind of sink in, and she said, "Oh, okay." And she went over and sat down, and then I stepped up to the counter, and just about that time, she jumped up from her seat. She said, "But it says on the board, Chicago, Boston." The agent said, "Yes, you're going to go to Chicago, get off the plane, get on a plane for Hartford. But it says Boston." You know, and you know what the problem is. You know that it's simple, it's easy to take care of. But she's intimidated. She's scared. She's going to go to the wrong place. I don't know why her family wasn't there to help her. I felt very bad for her, but she was by herself and very confused by this. And she was afraid if she got on this plane, even though you can change planes in Chicago, she was going to end up in Boston. And that isn't where she wanted to go. Unbelievers are something of the opposite, though, of what that little old lady was going through yesterday. They have chosen a way of looking at the world and a way of thinking and a way of living that is going to land them in Boston, pardon the expression, maybe we should say Boston Harbor so you know how bad it is going to land them in Boston, and they think they can get off the plane in Chicago, but they can't. And basically what I want to teach you to do is not let them off the plane. When they've chosen a worldview, make sure they know they're going all the way to Boston, and in this case it means all the way to hell. And hell doesn't simply mean, but it certainly is the most important meaning, it doesn't simply mean that after they go through this life they're going to face the judgment of God and be utter terror for the rest of eternity. That is hell. But hell has begun on earth for those who will not know the source of life, Jesus Christ. And hell has begun on earth not just because their family lives are messed up, not just because their own psychological state is messed up, not just because there's social problems among unbelievers, but hell has begun intellectually as well. Unbelievers don't ordinarily, although sometimes they do, and that's why we latch on to these examples when we see them, but they don't ordinarily let on that intellectually things are really messed up for them. But things are. And they are on their way to Boston, but they think they can get off at Chicago. They think there's a way off. And there isn't, except for the counter worldview that is found in the Bible. Now, did you understand what I just said? You follow that? Unbelievers have chosen a way of looking at the world and looking at how they know what they know and looking at how they should live their lives, which is contrary to what the Bible teaches. And because they've chosen that, they've got it they're on a plane that's heading somewhere they don't want to end up. And they're looking for a place to bail, but there isn't one. And so you're going to defend the faith by running their faith right into the ground, or into Boston if I use the metaphor properly. So if you understand that, I guess we can call it a day, right? Okay. We'll come back tomorrow and just kind of put something on this. Well, we got a few extra minutes, so maybe we'll use that time wisely. This week I want to talk to you about the antagonism of unbelieving worldviews. Try to convince you that when you are dealing with unbelieving professors, unbelieving roommates, students at the college, that you're dealing with a worldview, you're dealing with an underlying philosophy, not simply with the eyeball observational facts. The facts are not what's really at stake, although it will sometimes seem like that. It will seem like, well, if we could just marshal better historical evidence, or better scientific evidence, or better psychological evidence, or whatever the field may be, if we could just get the facts, then we would win the respect of these people, or these professors. But that isn't where the issue really is. You do need to know the facts. In fact, you need to know the facts better than your professors. That will seem intimidating, but it is possible. Believe it or not, your professors... You remember the story of Gideon in the Bible? You know how Gideon sent the Philistines into, the Midianites, pardon me, into utter, terror of mind, into flight? He gave every one of his soldiers what was really the mark of the leader of a band of soldiers. Gave him the light that would lead them into the battle. And so as the Midianites looked up there and saw all of these, lights, they said, there must be a huge army behind that. Well, there wasn't. That was the army. They were seeing everything. But because they thought there was so many there, then they took off afraid. And of course, Gideon fell upon them. In the same way, unbelievers practice the Gideon strategy. They like to give you the idea that they are familiar with what's going on. They know all the options. They've read through them. They're way ahead of the game. Well, I don't want to be unrealistic and just turn it around and pretend like we know all the options and we know better than they. But I want you to be reminded of the fact that they're finite. And not just finite, they are lazy. And not just that, they are prejudicial. So when they get into a certain groove of thinking, they tend to pay attention to reading that follows that line of thought. They do not pay as much attention to others. Sometimes they just bluff. Your professors don't know as much as they think they do. And you know what they don't know for sure? They don't know the philosophical implications of their position, or they wouldn't be teaching this. Nor do they understand the Christian position. I suppose I could have an entire hour just on this one point. I'm going to take 2 minutes, though. Please take me at my word. If nothing else, just because I've been through, the hoops. I've jumped through all the hoops, proven that I can memorize like others. I can do footnotes like others. I can do this. I can do that. Just so I can play their game with them. I've gone through that for years and years and years. I went through that. Anybody who's been to graduate school as a Christian has come out alive knows what I'm talking about. You play the game. You learn how to do it. You have to impress them that you can do this, that, and the other. So I've done this for a long time, and I am dead certain that 90% of the people who oppose Christianity explicitly, in my experience, did not know what Christianity was. That's going to seem remarkable. You would think, well, the gospel's so simple. It's at every street corner. There's the big Baptist church down the street. I mean, everybody's got to know what the gospel is. These people know, and they've decided it's not true. Well, they have decided it's not true, but I'm also convinced they do not understand what it is. They do not know your worldview as well as you do. Nor do they understand that their worldview is going to Boston, which is to say going to hell. Pardon me if you're from Boston. It's going to hell. So you will be able to do this. I want you to see the antagonism of the unbeliever and to know that the facts, or what are called the facts, eyeball, observational type things, are not what separate you from the unbeliever. It's underlying worldviews. And so we're going to talk about philosophy. Not today. I have to warm you up to that. But everyone does philosophy. Not everyone does it well, but everyone does it. And so as Gary was telling you in the introduction, if I can teach you something about philosophical principles, whether you go on to be philosophy majors or not, I will have done you a favor. Because you'll be able to apply this, whatever field you go into. It could be architecture. Believe me, philosophical principles apply to architecture. I know, I see those skeptical looks on your faces. Okay, you want me to prove that it applies to architecture? Actually, in the ancient world, architecture was often a reflection of their philosophy. Not just affected by it. Architecture was in one... Take the ancient Egyptians and their pyramids. Take their symbols, the eye, top of the pyramid. Why did they have these sorts of things? So they think that was artistically pleasing? Anybody seen an eyeball at the top of the pyramid? It's not very pleasing at all, but it's very telling in terms of what they thought the nature of reality was and how we know about it. Yeah, philosophy applies to every field, and so we're going to spend some time talking about philosophy, and then most of the week we're going to deal with false worldviews, false philosophies. I'm going to try to give you some hand grenades that you can take into class with you. from the field experience that I've had. Some of the issues, which in any field are going to have to be addressed philosophically and are not addressed well by unbelievers. I'll go through what I think are the basic types of worldviews that are available and do an internal critique of each one of them. And then I'll talk about at least, well, if the Lord gives me the time, at least half dozen of the major problems that will be raised by unbelievers when they finally realize they've got to now defend themselves. They're going to come back at you with some things, and I'm going to try to talk about at least a half dozen of those sorts of issues. So that kind of plans out the week for you. Let's begin by realizing that although we're defending the Christian faith, we're going to try to do that rationally. We're going to try to use our intellects. Nevertheless, the Christian faith is just that. It's the Christian faith. You notice we don't speak of, I'm an adherent of Christian rationality. I'm an adherent of Christian philosophy. I mean, I say that every once in a while, but I doubt that very many of us, and even I don't very often talk that way. What we adhere to is called the faith. According to an old saw, faith is believing what you know ain't true. And when you get off to college, you're going to find that the students that you talk to and the professors that bother to interact with you will pretty much have that understanding that you've come as a Christian, but you're really living in two worlds. One, the world of reason, the world of intellect, the world of scholarship represented by the university. That's the one temple you worship at. And then on Sundays, you go to another kind of temple, another kind of sanctuary, and there you worship and you express your faith. And these two don't have anything to do with each other, except they're all part of one week for you. They're all part of your experience, but they don't really have any internal connection. Faith is one thing, rationality is another. And the devil would love for you to believe that. And sadly, there are some who profess to follow Jesus Christ, and I hope with all my heart that they do, but nevertheless, they profess to follow Jesus, but they're secret agents for the devil. Because they will encourage you to think that way too. That we have intellect and rationality over here, and faith over here. They are two different ball games. And faith is believing what you know ain't true. Now, there's a real advantage. I'm going to admit this. I don't think it's going to be worth the disadvantage. But let me tell you straight out, there is a real advantage if you believe that, if you follow that way of thinking. If that's your mindset, then you don't have to worry about anything you encounter at the university, do you? Since faith is believing what you know ain't true, when they prove that Christianity ain't true, you don't have to worry about that. That just increases my faith. You see, the more you show me that I can't believe this, the more religious I am to hold on. I've actually known people. It's not just, theologians that talk this kind of nonsense. I've known people who live their lives that way. And, like a biology student, who says he's come to believe that the Bible can't be trusted scientifically. It's all messed up, just an ancient book of superstition. I said, well, then why do you believe the miracles about Jesus and his resurrection? Well, I know it isn't possible. I mean, I understand that. I've been taught that. But that just makes it all the more religious. I hold on to Jesus by faith. What an insult. What an insult to the Lord of history. What an insult to the Lord Jesus Christ to say, I'm holding on to you, Jesus, knowing that you ain't true. Do you understand that? Faith is not, from our perspective, believing what you know isn't true. Yet I know that in our society, this concept of faith is very popular. That is a tendency among people. When they want to hold to something rather fantastic, they want to believe that UFOs have come and visited us, or if they want to hold on to something which will be considered deplorable or pathetic, they continue to honor some politician that's been discredited, and they want to believe in the honor of this man and so forth. When you ask them why they believe these things, they will often say, I just have faith. Is there any evidence for what you believe? No. Or it's rather meager or extremely difficult to believe that it leads to the conclusion that they are holding to. They hold on to these convictions very strongly, very personally, and then fall back on the idea that they can believe things by faith. Even if what they believe doesn't appear to be true, and there seems to be very good reason for not believing it, they think that they can continue with their conviction because they believe it on faith. They persist in believing in the name of faith. Now, because you hear that, I trust you've seen that in the tabloids, television, what the movies portray as religion and so forth. That is the general concept that people have of faith. Faith is believing things for which there's very little reason, or believing things for which there's a lot of reason that you shouldn't believe them. Faith then comes to be seen as irrational or contrary to reason. Faith is seen as a personal commitment against all the obstacles that stand in the way of being honest and reasonable and looking at the evidence. I hold on to this conviction, then I have faith. And so when you go off to college as someone known to have faith, and as someone who encourages others to have faith, you will be immediately misperceived as someone who is calling for the crucifixion of the intellect. To have faith means to let your emotions run wild and turn off your brain. Christians live in two worlds, then, your professors think. They live in this emotional world, all these little things they do on Sunday morning, especially if you're Pentecostal. Do all these emotional things, but then Monday through Friday, and sometimes on Saturday if you use the library, Monday through Friday, your brain kicks back in. Okay, so it's like brain off, brain on. Go to church, brain off. Go to school, brain on. You get the point? Faith means the brain is off, the emotions are running. High degree of personal volition and commitment. Take this. Dictionary philosophy. There's a man who teaches in my field. He's supposed to know better. Peter Engels defines faith as belief in something despite the evidence against it. Faith in something despite the evidence against it, or belief in something even though there is an absence of evidence for it. So if you take either one of those understandings of what faith is, when we as Christians claim to have faith in the Bible, faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, we're going to be looked upon as irrational people. People who have turned off the brain and are letting our emotions run. We have a high degree of volitional commitment. Faith becomes a buzzword for living in two worlds. And I hate to tell you this because I don't wish to insult you, but you won't, well, maybe you will. But I don't think you'll hear as much as you probably should about how you will be disdained for having that concept of faith. People will think you are stupid. And you know what? If that is your concept of faith, you are. Now, I trust that you don't want to follow that understanding of faith. That's why you're at this particular conference. You want to be prepared to deal with college life, with life in general. You want to be able to deal with the opposition to Christianity, not by saying, oh, well, we don't worry about whether it's true or false. We just turn off our brain and enjoy feeling good about Jesus. And the Bible doesn't teach that view of faith. And because it doesn't teach it, I think it is fair to say, without trying to be personally insulting, it is stupid to believe that. It'd be better just to say Christianity is not true, but it makes me feel good. Just like the idea that there's a Santa Claus used to make me feel good. You know? It'd be better to say that about Jesus than to say, well, I believe in Jesus because I have faith, even though I know it's not true. Christianity is going to be looked upon as irrational by the people you come in contact with in school. But when they say that Christianity is irrational, they will not all mean the same thing by that. And so we're going to spend a few minutes, I'll try to make use of the board here, to draw some distinctions so that you might understand very clearly what the different kinds of irrationality are with which you might be charged. Let's count how many ways there are to be irrational, okay? That is, how many different ways will your having faith in Jesus Christ or faith in the Bible be deemed stupid by people at the university? Some people will pit Christian faith against reason because they feel that the teachings of the Bible are themselves, the specific teachings of the Bible, are irrational. Some people, for instance, will look upon the idea of God becoming man as a logical contradiction. They'll look at the incarnation as irrational. For them, this idea of there being a God-man is incoherent. It's a violation of the alleged laws of logic. And so when they charge Christianity with being irrational, what they mean is that it is contrary to the rules of logic. It is illogical. So here's one way to be irrational. Am I writing large enough that you can read that? Okay, violate the laws of logic. When somebody says Christianity is irrational, they might mean very specifically you believe things like the Trinity or the Incarnation. You believe things which are illogical. There's another way that is a pointed way in which we are considered irrational. People will sometimes think there is utterly no observational, scientific, historical substantiation for the magnificent claims that are made in the Bible. The Bible tells us the sun stood still. It tells us that Jesus multiplied the loaves, that he raised the dead. Now, when you look at claims like that and say that's irrational, and what you mean is there's no evidence for that, there's no scientific explanation for that, what you're getting at is that there are empirical defects in the claims made by Christians or in the claims found in the Bible. And I want no one to be embarrassed. We're going to do this all week long. I have to find out. How many of you know what that word empirical means? Better, how many of you don't? Okay, let's talk about that for a second. You know what logic is. You have some general idea. We're going to come back later in the week and talk about it too. In the ancient world, among the Greek philosophers, there were two basic approaches to doing philosophy. I like to simplify it for my beginning students by saying some philosophers said, if you want to figure out the world, you have to stop and think about it. Kind of like go to your armchair, sit down, and reflect. Now, if this is the case, then how can that be the case, and how do I bring these two things together? Now, philosophers who followed that stop and think technique were rationalists. They said we need clear and distinct ideas. We need to make our ideas consistent with each other. What's really important is the life of the mind, making sure that the things that I hold to don't conflict with one another. Other philosophers were less patient with that. Theirs was the go look and see method of figuring out the world. That is, they said, whatever you may imagine in your armchair as you're speculating and using your reason, we've got to make sense out of what we encounter in the world, what we see and what we touch, what we taste. We need to have the facts. That's what Americans think are the facts. The facts are what you can touch, what you can see. And so they were the seeing is believing sort of philosopher. Now, the seeing is believing philosophy is known as empiricism. Empiricism. Technically, empiricism says all that you know can be reduced to observational posits. But we aren't going to get into the full-blown theory of it. I just want you to know how the adjective empirical is used. If I say empirical, I'll be referring to a way of knowing that's dependent upon observation, personal experience, or the senses. Okay, now back to the point. Some people would criticize Christianity as being irrational because they say it is contrary to the empirical evidence. So here are two ways to be irrational, two ways to be criticized for being irrational. If there is no substantiation for the claims made in the Bible, no empirical substantiation, or if the claims made in the Bible are in conflict with each other, logically speaking, then we will be told that we are irrational. That is to say, such critics will find specific imperfections in Christianity, and they'll go after them. They'll say, how can you believe that an axe head can float? They'll say, how can you believe in creation, the special creation of man? How can you believe that a man is actually God? So they're going after specific imperfections, and you may think, wow, these are pretty strong, criticisms. But I'm going to bracket them for right now. We'll deal with them throughout the week. Take my word for it. Those are the easy ones. Really, if it comes down to that, if we just have to show that our various dogmas are logically consistent, if we just have to show that we are not in conflict with the known principles of science or historiography or something like that, it's a cakewalk. It may not look like that to you because you haven't had as much experience in the field. And it does take research and it does take thinking to deal with those, but they are relatively simple. I want to deal with the tougher forms of irrationality, or the charges against us of being irrational. Much more vicious is the claim made by critics who judge that the Christian faith is irrational because they say to be religious or to be a Christian is to be dedicated to believing the absurd for its absurdity. Now, I want to make a point here, a distinction that's very important. I might believe that I do believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and somebody might say, that's absurd. But what he means by that is, it's empirically defective to believe that sort of thing. It's unscientific. I'm not talking about that kind of criticism. I'm now talking about the criticism that says, you believe something that's absurd just because it is absurd. That's the conception of faith that many people have. Many think that religious believers glory in the fact that their faith is without rational support. They glory in the fact that it's apparently untrue, that it has to be endorsed in the face of good sense and over against contrary reasons. And sadly, unbelievers who think that that is what faith is all about have often been given the damnable help of certain Christian theologians who will say that Christianity is indifferent to logic. We don't care about logic, really. We're indifferent to science. We're indifferent to evidence. In fact, it gets so bad among the neo-Orthodox that sometimes we're even indifferent to truth. Who cares about the Western concept of truth, we'll be told. What's important is existential relationships. Oh, barf. No wonder my job, in a school of philosophy as a Christian was so hard. When I have people who call themselves Christians endorsing this idea, we believe the absurd because it is absurd. And you're probably sitting there, I'm sure you're sitting, if you're awake, you're sitting there thinking, why would anybody do that? And that's the furthest thing from what you want to do. That seems so suicidal. Well, I'm not going to make it very palatable because I don't think it is palatable, but let me make it a little easier by just telling you this. In one sense of the word religious, that's a very religious thing to do. In one sense. And it's a sense which we see among evangelical Christians, should see among evangelical Christians. And what I mean is, to hold something religiously means that you are committed, that you have faith in it, that you are going to hold on despite the ridicule that comes. Now, the Bible speaks about that. The Bible says the world will call what we believe foolishness. And to be really religious means to hold on to something that appears to be foolish even though it isn't. Now, in the case that I'm talking about, though, we have people who hold on to things and they say it is foolish. And just because it seems foolish or absurd, they're very religious in holding on to it. If you had a 19-year-old, let's say you get to college and here's your first roommate, and you find out come about December that your roommate is looking forward to Christmas because he or she believes Santa Claus is coming. You'd say, yeah, I was 3 or 4. I believe that kind of stuff too, but I mean, you know better, right? You know it was just your parents doing that, right? I hope I'm not letting anybody down by getting, yeah. Sorry if I'm the one to break it to you. No. You talk to your roommate and you say, you know there's no Santa Claus. And your roommate says, yeah, all the evidence is against it. I agree. But I'm very devoted to the idea of Santa Claus. Now, don't laugh at that. Who was the writer back in the 40s who wrote this famous essay that appears, Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus sort of thing. This idea of there being a Santa Claus has so gripped my heart that I've given my life to Santa Claus. Now, would you say that this person had a lot of religious devotion? Not proper religion. I'm not asking you to endorse it. Yeah, there's a sense in which we call that religious. He holds on to that very religiously, even against the facts. Well, so there are people who think that being religious means believing something that's absurd just because it is absurd. And often we as Christians are put in that category. There are people who think that we elevate the value of our personal faith in direct proportion to the degree that our faith is dubious or blind or mystical. It's thought that believers will degrade the worth of their faith to any extent that their faith accords with good reason. Back in 1895, the insane philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he was insane, wrote in his book, Antichrist, Attempt at a Critique of Christianity, wrote of his derision toward the attitude that says faith must be brought into line with the facts by saying, this was Nietzsche saying, faith means not wanting to know what is true. Faith means holding to the absurd because it is absurd. But all criticism in this vein flows from a very fundamental mistake about the nature of Christian faith. And one of the best books written in the 20th century, I believe, still, by J. Gresham Machen, entitled, What is Faith? Machen, a Presbyterian theologian who fought the battle apologetically with unbelievers and liberals as well as with the world, those who were secular scholars, liberals in the church, unbelievers outside the church. Machen wrote in his book, What is Faith? We believe that Christianity flourishes not in the darkness, but in the light. He said that the Spirit would bring about an awakening in the church, and he said one of the ways in which the Spirit would do that would be through an awakening of the intellect. Machen did not want people to believe in the gospel because it sounded good, even though the scientists and the historians told them it couldn't be true. He fervently resisted what he called the disastrous opposition that has been set up between knowledge and faith. And I quote him, faith need not be too humble or too apologetic before the bar of reason. Christian faith is a thoroughly reasonable thing. Are we irrational because we believe the absurd? No. We believe what appears to be absurd to the world, and our job is to show the world that what it believes is in fact the true absurdity. Or to go back to my metaphor, theirs is the plane heading for Boston with no letting off in Chicago. So regardless of what certain misguided spokesmen may say, the Bible itself is not indifferent to logical blunders or factual mistakes. It was just in order to vindicate the truth of his religious claims and conceptions that Moses challenged the magicians of Pharaoh's court. It was just to vindicate the truth of his religious convictions that Elijah competed with and taunted the priest of Baal on Mount Carmel. The Old Testament prophets knew that their words would be demonstrated to be true when their predictions were fulfilled in history for all to see. Notice that when Jesus came into this world, he claimed to be the truth. He saw in his resurrection a mighty sign and wonder that provided evidence for the veracity of his claims and for the apostolic message based upon them. Despite what the Jews and Greeks might think to themselves, wrote Paul, the gospel is in fact the very wisdom of God, which destroys the arrogance of worldly philosophy. In 1 Corinthians 1, after Paul had been at the center of Greek philosophy in Athens, he leaves Athens and he writes to Corinth. Very important to see what he says in those first 2 chapters about the relationship of faith and reason at that point. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 20, Paul spoke of the claims of knowledge falsely so called. You see, Paul was eager to reason with people about Christ. Not because there isn't a place for faith, but because faith is not contrary to reason. In fact, faith, it turns out, is the very foundation for reasoning. Boy, now there's a reversal. Most people think we all have to stand on the platform of reason and then maybe find a place for faith. Paul's attitude was, if you don't have faith, there's no place to reason. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Paul said. Bring them on. We're ready for them. Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And God has continued to make foolish the wisdom of this world from the first century down to today. And God will continue to do that job of making those who promote reason over against faith look like fools. And He's going to do that job through you. You find that hard to believe. A lot of people looking at you may find that hard to believe. But God's in the business of doing amazing things. And He'll do it with you. There was a day when a lot of people would not have bet on David. There's this little scruffy shepherd kid, too short to be a king, not equipped. All he has is a slingshot, going against the world's giant. What a great lesson. I hope you haven't consigned that to, the Sunday school past for yourselves. God does great things with weak instruments, and He will continue to make the wisdom of this world crumble before little 19 and 20-year-old college kids who have nothing more but a slingshot and a few well-chosen questions to show that, guess what? The plane of unbelief, it's still going to Boston. Let's take a break and we'll come back for more.